When the phone rang in that small Aberdeen house, Kurt Cobain's mother shouted upstairs, "Kurt, phone for you." Nobody knew that this call would mark the beginning of a revolution that would change music forever. It was 1988. Mid-year. Kurt Cobain was probably in his bedroom, alone with his guitar. He'd been writing songs for 6 years. 6 years of the same style. 6 years alone. In a small room. Nobody listening. His mother, Wendy, called up the stairs, "Kurt, phone." When Kurt picked up, there was a voice with a British accent on the other end. John Robb, from Sounds magazine. For the first time in Kurt's life, a music journalist was calling him. "Hello, is this Kurt Cobain from Nirvana?" Kurt answered with a tired voice. He was only 21 years old, but his voice sounded like it belonged to the oldest person in the world. John Robb would later recall that moment. "I thought he sounded like the oldest person in the world, singing in a young person's body. He sounded completely world-weary, dramatic." But here's where everything changed. Kurt only had one single out. Love Buzz, released on Sub Pop, pressed in 1,000 copies, a cover of Shocking Blue. That's it. Nobody knew Nirvana. In fact, they were overshadowed by Sub Pop's other bands, Mudhoney and Tad. But when John Robb heard that voice, he felt something. Kurt sang like he was tearing flesh from his throat. He reminded John of John Lennon. But there was something darker, something more savage in it. "Kurt, can we talk about your songwriting?" John asked. Kurt hesitated. This was his first interview ever. There were no deep questions, because there was no internet, no information, just a 2-line press release. John was trying to figure Kurt out from wreck. "I've been writing songs for 6 years," Kurt finally said. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "In this style of music. The last 2 years, me and Chris got really serious about it." Intense whisper. "Wait a minute, don't miss this detail. 6 years. Let that sink in." While other kids in Aberdeen were learning to log trees, the main industry in town, Kurt was locked in his bedroom, writing songs. Songs nobody heard, songs nobody wanted here. "What would you have done if Nirvana didn't work out?" John asked. Kurt's answer was immediate. "Keep trying in another band. I can probably say I've never learned the fine art of logging." There was something in the way he said it. Not joking, not bitter, just resigned. Like he knew he was never meant for that life. Like he'd rather die than become another body of the logging mills. John Robb would later remember calling Kurt's mother's house. "I still have the number in my address book," he'd say years later. I can remember his mom on the phone shouting upstairs, "Kurt, there's somebody on the phone for you." He'd never done an interview before, so it was like starting fresh. Mysterious, but the real shock was still coming. That first phone call was just the beginning. A year later, in the summer of 1989, John Robb would fly to New York to meet Nirvana in person. They were touring with Tad, playing small venues to handfuls of people. John stayed with them for 5 days in a tiny apartment on Avenue B. No beds, sleeping on the floor. It was so hot they could barely breathe. And that's when he discovered who Kurt Cobain really was. Urgent. Now here's what you haven't seen yet. On July 14, 1989, in that cramped New York apartment, John sat down with Kurt and Chris Novoselic for a proper interview. 20 minutes that would capture Nirvana. At their most raw, most honest, most vulnerable. Kurt talked about Aberdeen. About the suffocating small-town life. About the desperate need to escape. "Sometimes I try to make things harder for myself," Kurt said, his voice distant. "Just to try to make myself a bit more angry. I try out a few subconscious things, I suppose. Like conflicts with other people." Wait, what? Kurt was admitting something dark here. Something nobody had heard before. He was saying he deliberately created conflict in his life. He needed anger. He needed pain. Because that's where the music came from. Dark, hold on. This gets darker. "Most of the lyrics on the Bleach album are about life in Aberdeen," Kurt continued. His voice was flat, but underneath there was something churning. Something violent. John Robb noticed it too. Years later, he described watching Nirvana play live that week. Kurt has a voice that cuts right through the noise. At the end of their set, they trash their gear, shove their guitars through the teetering roof, and kick over Chad Channing's drum kit. It's an awesome demolition job. But in that apartment, before the shows, before the chaos, Kurt was calm, too calm, like the eye of a hurricane. I imagine I am becoming happier because I am escaping, Kurt said. Then he paused. I find myself sometimes making things hard for myself so I can still have a little bit of anger. Shocking you're not believing this yet, but Kurt wasn't suicidal. Not then. But he was already addicted to his own darkness. He was afraid of happiness. He needed the anger to write. He needed the pain to create. The songs are getting poppier and poppier as I'm getting happier and happier, Kurt admitted. They're probably about conflicts in relationships, emotions and feelings. There it was, the confession. Kurt's music was getting softer because he was escaping Aberdeen, and he hated it. He was terrified that happiness would kill his creativity. Intense. But wait, there's something nobody talks about. In that same interview, Kurt revealed his creative process, and it was shocking. When I write a song, the lyrics are the least important thing, he said. So I don't dwell on it at all. I can actually have 2 or 3 different subjects within a song, and the title will mean nothing to the rest of the music. Think about that. The man who would write Smells Like Teen Spirit, the anthem of a generation, was saying lyrics didn't matter to him. He could throw random words together, multiple topics in song, the title completely disconnected from the meaning. It was all about the feeling, the emotion, the violence of the sound, the aromatic pause, the shocking truth nobody saw coming. During that same New York trip, another journalist captured something even more revealing. Hanmi Hubbard, barely 17 years old, interviewed Nirvana at Kurt's house in Olympia for her college newspaper. She was nervous, only 2 interviews under her belt. Kurt and the band could have dismissed her, laughed at her, ignored her. Instead, they were kind. After the interview, Kurt told her it was probably their best interview to date. But here's what's chilling. Kurt kept in touch with her afterward. When he found out how young she was, he told her she should write a book about her life story. Oh, the irony, Hanmi would later write. Because 5 years later, Kurt would be dead. And she would still be alive, writing about him. Soft. But in 1989, nobody knew what was coming. During Hanmi's interview, the band was relaxed, almost happy. They sat around listening to the Pixies' Doolittle album. Pixies are my favorite band, Kurt said, his voice lighter than usual. Right now they're unbelievable. Chad Channing agreed. They talked about producers, about Jack Endino, who'd recorded their demos, about wanting to work with him again. Kurt's girlfriend Tracy Miranda was there. Kurt's friend Jason Everman, who'd just joined the band. Everyone was laughing, joking around. We'd like to maybe go into a better studio next time, Jason said. But we still have to have Jack Endino looking over his shoulder all the time, Kurt added quickly. Dark whisper. Now the truly terrifying part begins. At the end of the interview, Kurt did something strange. He gave Hanmi a copy of the band's demo tape, and he included a handwritten note. The note read, "This contract is a relief of details compared to the Sub Pop agreement I just signed. 3 LPs and 3 long years. I feel as if I've signed my life away." 3 long years. Kurt felt like he'd signed his life away. In 1989, 5 years before he actually would. Urgent whisper. Don't you see what's happening here? Kurt was already feeling trapped. Already feeling like he'd lost control, and the fame hadn't even started yet. Nevermind was still 2 years away. MTV was still 2 years away. The global superstardom that would crush him was still invisible on the horizon. But he could feel it coming. "I've signed my life away," he wrote. And then, at the bottom of the note, he added something else. Something that would haunt anyone who read it later. P.S. This is how I really spell my name. Not Kurt Cobain. He signed it differently. A reminder that even his name wasn't really his anymore. Mysterious. But here's what nobody expected. Back in that John Robb interview in New York, Kurt talked about the future, about where the band was heading. We're getting a good mixture now from the heaviness, like both of the extremes of our styles combined, Kurt said. Instead of just really heavy, relentless, monster scary songs and a light pop song, he was describing Smells Like Teen Spirit 2 years before it existed. He was describing the formula that would make Nirvana the biggest band in the world. The soft verse, the explosive chorus, the quiet, loud, quiet dynamic that would define grunge. But he didn't know it yet. Nobody did. John Robb would later say, "I think this might have been one of the first descriptions of Smells Like Teen Spirit. Dramatic. The moment everything was about to explode." Kurt and Chris talked about their live shows with John. About the intensity, about the need to destroy everything on stage. "It's a nice relief," Chris Novoselic said. "A release of anger on stage." "Yeah, it's a nice feeling," Chris continued. "It's something that needs to be done at least twice a week. The more people screaming at you, the more you are into smashing everything up." Kurt didn't say much during this part. He just nodded. But John Robb saw something in Kurt's eyes. Something dangerous. Something that suggested the destruction wasn't just an act. It wasn't just rock and roll theater. Kurt needed it. The violence, the chaos, the annihilation of everything around him. "I puncture every speaker in the cabinets," Kurt would later say in another interview. There were 12 speakers to puncture. "Really, I can't think of anything better to do than to puncture speakers. That's my favorite piece of equipment to destroy. It's a lot of fun." Intense whisper. But you still haven't heard the most disturbing part. In that 1989 interview, Kurt talked about his childhood, about what made him who he was. He mentioned sitting in his bedroom for years, playing guitar alone, writing songs nobody heard. "I sat in my bedroom and played guitar," he said simply. But there was more to it. Kurt had been escaping into music since he was a kid, not because he loved it, because he needed it. Because the real world was unbearable. His parents divorced when he was 7. His mother kicked him out when he was 17. His father wanted him to join the Navy, made him pawn his guitar, had a recruiter come to the house 2 nights in a row. Kurt ran. He chose homelessness over the Navy. He chose uncertainty over giving up his guitar. Shocking. And here's the part that will shock you most. In those early interviews, 1988, 1989, Kurt was honest, vulnerable, real. He talked about his influences, about the Pixies, about how their album Surfer Rosa changed everything for him, about wanting to mix heavy and pop sounds. He talked about Aberdeen, about the miserable weather, about the gloomy rock music that came from the Pacific Northwest. "It's because we are secluded, out on a limb up here," Kurt told John Robb. "The local scene has always had an element of rock in it, but it's been a gloomy element. That's why I reckon you guys in the UK like it, because your rock is on the gloomy side too. Maybe it's the weather, we have the same sort of miserable climate as you have." He was funny, self-aware. He understood that his darkness came from somewhere real, from the rain, from the isolation, from the logging town that produced nothing but despair. Dramatic. But then fame came, and everything changed. By 1991, Kurt couldn't do interviews like this anymore. He became guarded, defensive, angry at journalists, angry at the world. But in 1988, in 1989, he was still open, still hopeful, in his own dark way. "We're loving touring America," he told John Robb in that 1989 interview. Those words would become impossible for him to say just 3 years later. Dark. The tragedy was already written. Looking back at these first interviews, you can see it all. The self-destructive tendencies, the addiction to anger, the fear of happiness, the feeling of being trapped even before the trap closed. Kurt told John Robb he deliberately made things harder for himself to stay angry. Kurt told Hanmi Hubbard he felt like he'd signed his life away. Kurt wrote in his notes that he was scared of what was coming. And 5 years later, he was dead. Emotional. But here's what makes it even more painful. In those early interviews, Kurt talked about his dreams, about what he wanted to achieve. If Nirvana didn't work out, "I'd keep trying in another band," he said. He had determination. He had drive. He wasn't going to give up. "I can probably say I've never learned the fine art of logging," he joked. He knew he was meant for something else. Something bigger. Something that would take him out of Aberdeen forever. And he got it. He got everything he wanted. And it killed him. And tense. The final truth nobody wants to face. In 1989, John Robb spent 5 days with Nirvana in New York. He helped them carry their amps up and down 3 flights of stairs. He slept on the floor with them in that tiny apartment. He watched them play to crowds of 20 people. It was a very hands-on existence, John would later say. Kurt was just another struggling musician. Broke, unknown, desperate for any attention. And John Robb gave him that attention. Made his single of the week in Sounds magazine. Did his first interview. Believed in him when nobody else did. 5 years later, John Robb would hear that Kurt was dead. And he would remember that tired voice on the phone in 1988. The voice of the oldest person in the world, trapped in a young person's body. Dark whisper. The voice that knew what was coming all along. In that first interview, Kurt said something that would echo forever. "I've been writing songs for 6 years in this style of music. 6 years of preparation. 6 years of isolation. 6 years of anger. Carefully cultivated and preserved. And then in just 5 years of fame, it was all over." Kurt Cobain's first interview captured him at his most raw, his most honest. Before the fame, before the drugs, before Courtney, before everything that would eventually destroy him. In those interviews, you can hear the real Kurt, the one who sat alone in his bedroom in Aberdeen, writing songs nobody would hear. The one who was terrified of happiness, because it might take away his ability to create. The one who knew, deep down, that he'd signed his life away. Shocking pause. And the most terrifying part, he was right. Everything he feared came true. The contract with Sub Pop led to the contract with DGC. The success of Bleach led to Nevermind. The small venues in New York led to stadiums around the world. And Kurt, who'd been writing songs alone in his bedroom for 6 years, suddenly had millions of people watching him, judging him, demanding pieces of him. "I feel as if I've signed my life away," he wrote in 1994 he took it back, the only way he knew how. Emotional. This is the story nobody tells about Kurt Cobain's first interviews. Not the mythology. Not the legend. Not the icon. Just the truth. A 21-year-old kid from a logging town. A tired voice on the phone. A bedroom full of unheard songs. A desperate need to escape that would eventually lead him right back to the tanks he was running from. John Robb asked him in 1989, "What would you do if Nirvana didn't work out?" Kurt answered, "Keep trying in another band." But there was no other band. There was only Nirvana. There was only the trap. There was only the inevitable conclusion. When that phone rang in Aberdeen in 1988, Kurt's mother shouted upstairs, "Kurt, phone for you." And Kurt answered, and the world changed forever. But Kurt Cobain never escaped that bedroom. Never escaped Aberdeen. Never escaped the anger he needed to keep himself alive. Dark. In the end, the escape killed him. And it all started with one phone call. One interview. One moment when a British journalist believed in a voice he heard on a 7-inch single. "I thought he sounded like the oldest person in the world singing in a young person's body," John Robb said. He was right. Kurt Cobain was already old in 1988. Already tired. Already world-weary. He just had 5 more years to prove it to everyone else. Dramatic final. The revolution that changed music forever began with a tired voice saying, "I've been writing songs for 6 years, in this style of music. 6 years of anger. 5 years of fame. 27 years of life." And it all started with that first interview. The one where Kurt Cobain told the truth. Before he learned he wasn't allowed to anymore.